Do you know how many people you murdered?
Yeah, but I'd rather not mention it.
What drives a person to ask for a single olive with the pit still in it, or a bizarre feast fit for a king? Death, I believe. Imagine standing on the precipice of the unknown, gazing into the abyss of your own mortality.
Robert Frada has been on death row for nearly 3 decades and is scheduled for execution tomorrow night in Huntsville.
As the sands of time slip through your fingers, what final wish would you make before the curtain falls?
I am sorry that my acts of self-defense ended up in court like this.
Well, join us as we delve into some of the most disturbing last wishes of death row inmates. Lawrence Russell Brewer. Lawrence Russell Brewer, a name etched in infamy, is perhaps best known for his horrifying crime and his extraordinary final meal request. Brewer was a white supremacist who, along with 2 accomplices, committed one of the most brutal hate crimes in recent American history. In June 1998, in Jasper, Texas, Brewer and his cohorts kidnapped James Byrd Jr., a 40-year-old African-American man. They chained Byrd by his ankles to the back of a pickup truck and dragged him for 3 miles along a country road, resulting in Byrd's horrific death. Brewer's heinous actions led to widespread outrage and significant media coverage, highlighting the persistent issue of racial violence in the United States. Following his arrest, Brewer was charged with capital murder. The trial took place in 1999, and Brewer was swiftly convicted and sentenced to death, a fate that underscored the severity of his crime. His case became a focal point in the discussions about hate crimes and capital punishment. As Brewer's execution date approached, he made a final meal request that was as excessive as it was controversial. Brewer asked for 2 chicken fried steaks smothered in gravy with sliced onions, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger with all the fixings, a cheese omelet with ground beef, tomatoes, onions, bell peppers, and jalapenos, a pound of barbecued meat with half a loaf of white bread, a meat lover's pizza, 3 fajitas, a bowl of fried okra with ketchup, a pint of Bluebell vanilla ice cream, a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts, and 3 root beers. The sheer magnitude of Brewer's request caught the attention of the public and the media. However, what made this request particularly disturbing was that when the lavish meal was presented to him, Brewer refused to eat any of it. This act of defiance, or perhaps indifference, led to significant repercussions. In response to what was seen as an abuse of the final meal privilege, Texas prison officials decided to abolish the practice of granting specific last meal requests to condemned inmates. On September 21, 2011, Lawrence Brewer was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. His final act left a legacy not just of his crime, but also of his controversial last wish. John Henry Ramirez. John Henry Ramirez is a name that has garnered significant attention due to both the heinous nature of his crime and the unusual nature of his final wish. Ramirez was a Texas man convicted of a brutal murder that shocked the local community and garnered widespread media coverage. In 2004, Ramirez, along with 2 female accomplices, embarked on a robbery spree in Corpus Christi, Texas. The spree culminated in the murder of Pablo Castro, a 45-year-old convenience store clerk. Ramirez approached Castro as he was taking out the trash and, in a sudden and violent attack, stabbed him 29 times, leading to his immediate death. The motive was robbery, but the brutality of the act suggested something far more sinister. Ramirez and his accomplices fled the scene with a paltry $1.25 US, highlighting the senselessness of the crime. Following the murder, Ramirez evaded capture for more than 3 years, fleeing to Mexico. However, in 2008, he was apprehended and extradited to the United States. His trial was swift, given the overwhelming evidence against him, and in 2007, he was convicted of capital murder. The jury, moved by the brutality of the crime and the impact on Castro's family, sentenced Ramirez to death. As Ramirez's execution date loomed, he made an unusual final wish. Unlike many who request elaborate meals, Ramirez sought spiritual solace. He requested that his pastor, Dana Moore, be allowed to lay hands on him and pray aloud as he was being executed. This request, while simple, sparked a significant legal battle. Ramirez argued that his religious rights were being infringed upon when prison officials denied his request, citing security concerns. The case escalated to the U.S. Supreme Court, which, in a rare move, granted a stay of execution to consider the religious freedom implications. In March 2022, the court ruled in favor of Ramirez, affirming that his religious rights should be respected. This landmark decision underscored the importance of religious freedom even for those condemned to die. On October 5, 2022, John Henry Ramirez was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. As per his final wish, Pastor Dana Moore was present, laying hands on Ramirez and praying aloud during the execution. Philip Workman. Philip Workman's story is a story of crime, remorse, and a final wish that captured the public's imagination. Workman was a Tennessee man whose life took a dark turn, leading to a series of events that ended in tragedy and a controversial execution. In 1981, Workman, struggling with substance addiction and financial woes, attempted to rob a Wendy's restaurant in Memphis, Tennessee. The robbery went horribly wrong when police officers arrived on the scene, leading to a confrontation. During the chaos, Lieutenant Ronald Oliver was shot and killed. Workman was immediately apprehended and charged with the murder of Lieutenant Oliver, a charge he would always contest, claiming that the fatal shot was fired by another officer during the crossfire. Despite his claims, Workman was convicted of first-degree murder in 1982 and sentenced to death. The trial and subsequent appeals were marked by controversies, including allegations of police misconduct and questions about the ballistics evidence used to convict him. Nevertheless, Workman remained on death row for over 2 decades, his case drawing the attention of anti-death penalty activists and advocates for criminal justice reform. As his execution date approached, Workman made a final wish that was both unusual and deeply humanitarian. He requested that a large vegetarian pizza be given to a homeless person. This selfless request was a stark contrast to the extravagant or bizarre last meal requests often made by death row inmates. It was a reflection of Workman's desire to do some good in his final moments, highlighting a sense of remorse and a wish to make a positive impact, however small. The Tennessee prison officials, however, refused to honor Workman's request. They cited policy and procedural reasons, stating that they could not fulfill a last meal request that involved a third party. This decision sparked outrage and disappointment among Workman's supporters and the wider public. In response, many people across the country took it upon themselves to fulfill his wish. On the day of his execution, homeless shelters in Tennessee and beyond received numerous vegetarian pizzas from anonymous donors, paying tribute to Workman's final act of kindness. On May 9, 2007, Philip Workman was executed by lethal injection at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. His execution was a somber event, marked by the knowledge that his last wish had inspired a wave of generosity and compassion. James Edward Smith. James Edward Smith, an inmate whose final wish raised eyebrows and stoked imaginations, is a unique figure in the annals of death row history. Smith's crime was as shocking as his last request was bizarre, leaving an indelible mark on the criminal justice system and the public psyche. In March 1983, James Edward Smith, a former tax accountant, walked into the Union National Bank in Houston, Texas, with a grandiose plan to commit a robbery. Armed and desperate, Smith attempted to make off with a significant sum of money. However, the robbery quickly went awry, and in the ensuing chaos, Smith shot and killed Larry Don Rojas, a bank teller. His attempt to flee was unsuccessful, and Smith was promptly apprehended by the police. Smith's trial was swift, and given the clear evidence against him, he was convicted of first-degree murder in October 1983. The jury, moved by the cold-blooded nature of the crime and the loss of an innocent life, sentenced Smith to death. Over the years, Smith's appeals and legal maneuvers failed to overturn his sentence, and his execution date was set. As his execution loomed, James Edward Smith made a final request that was both eerie and perplexing. Smith asked for a lump of dirt, specifically for a voodoo ritual known as a hexing ritual. The request was deeply rooted in his belief in voodoo practices, and he intended to use the dirt to mark his passage to the afterlife or to protect his spirit in the next world. This unsettling request was unprecedented and caused considerable consternation among prison officials. Ultimately, Smith's request for dirt was denied. Prison officials cited security and procedural concerns, stating that providing dirt for a ritual was outside the bounds of what could be allowed. Faced with the refusal, Smith settled for a much simpler and more conventional last meal, a cup of yogurt. On June 25, 1990, James Edward Smith was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. His death, like his life, was marked by a blend of the mundane and the bizarre. The denial of his unusual last wish only added to the mystique surrounding his final moments, cementing his place in the history of infamous last meal requests. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, left a chilling legacy marked by his gruesome crimes and eerie final meal request. Known as the Killer Clown, due to his public persona as Pogo the Clown at children's parties, Gacy's life was a disturbing blend of charm and horror. Gacy's criminal activities came to light in the late 1970s. Between 1972 and 1978, he lured young men and boys to his home in Norwood Park, Illinois, under the pretense of offering them work or other favors. Once there, Gacy would overpower his victims, mistreated them, and ultimately murder them. He buried 26 of his victims in the crawl space of his home, while others were discarded in nearby rivers. The sheer scale of his crimes, 33 confirmed murders, shocked the nation. Gacy's double life as a respected community member and a ruthless killer was unraveled in December 1978, when police began investigating the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast. This investigation led them to Gacy's home, where they discovered the horrific truth. Gacy was arrested, and during his trial, his sanity was a key issue. However, the overwhelming evidence of his guilt left little doubt in the minds of the jurors. In March 1980, Gacy was convicted of all 33 murders and sentenced to death. His execution was delayed by numerous appeals and procedural issues, but his fate was ultimately sealed. As Gacy's execution date approached, he made a final meal request that was as unnerving as his crimes. He asked for a dozen deep-fried shrimp, a bucket of original recipe KFC chicken, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. The request for KFC was particularly disturbing, as Gacy had once managed 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa, during the 1960s. This connection to his past, where he presented himself as a model citizen and businessman, highlighted the jarring contrast between his public facade and his private monstrosity. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in criminal history, but his crimes and his unsettling final meal request continue to captivate and horrify. Teresa Lewis. Teresa Lewis's case is a notable one, marked by its unusual circumstances and controversial outcome. She gained notoriety not only for her crimes, but also for her final wishes and the ensuing debate surrounding her execution. Teresa Lewis was a woman from Virginia whose life took a tragic turn with her involvement in a heinous crime. In October 2002, Lewis conspired with 2 men, Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, to murder her husband, Julian Lewis, and her stepson, Charles Lewis. The motive behind the murders was financial gain. As Lewis stood to benefit from life insurance policies on her husband and stepson, the brutal killings were carried out in cold blood at their home in Pittsylvania County, Virginia. Following the murders, Teresa Lewis was swiftly apprehended and charged with capital murder. In 2003, she pleaded guilty to her role in the crimes and was sentenced to death. Her case sparked significant debate due to her gender. She was one of the few women on death row in Virginia, and her limited intellectual abilities, which raised questions about her culpability and the fairness of the death penalty in cases involving mental limitations. As her execution date approached, Teresa Lewis made a poignant final wish. She requested fried chicken, peas with butter, and Dr. Pepper as her last meal. The simplicity of her request, coupled with the circumstances of her crime and her personal background, added a layer of poignancy to her impending execution. On September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. Her execution drew widespread attention due to her status as a female inmate and the ethical debates surrounding the death penalty, particularly concerning individuals with limited mental capacity. Stephen Anderson. Stephen Wayne Anderson's criminal history began with a series of robberies in the early 1970s, but his most notorious act occurred in 1980. On June 25th of that year, Anderson murdered Elizabeth Lyman, an 81-year-old widow, at her home in San Bernardino, California. Anderson's motive was to steal Lyman's Social Security check, a shocking and brutal crime that shocked the local community. Anderson was apprehended shortly after the murder and later confessed to the crime. In 1981, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His trial highlighted the brutality of the crime and the impact on the victim's family, which contributed to the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. As Anderson's execution date approached, he made a final wish that raised eyebrows and sparked controversy. His request was for a Bible, which he intended to use during his final moments to read aloud and pray. This request reflected Anderson's spiritual contemplation and preparation for his impending death, contrasting with the violent nature of his crime. However, Anderson's final wish was not granted, as the prison officials cited security concerns regarding items that could be used for non-standard purposes. Despite this denial, Anderson remained focused on his spiritual well-being until his final moments. On January 29, 2002, Stephen Wayne Anderson was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison in California. His execution marked the culmination of over 2 decades of legal proceedings and appeals. Gary Gilmore. Gary Mark Gilmore was born on December 4, 1940, in Waco, Texas. His early life was turbulent, characterized by a troubled family environment and frequent run-ins with the law. By his mid-30s, Gilmore had spent more than half his life in correctional institutions for various crimes, including armed robbery. In 1976, shortly after being released on parole, Gilmore committed 2 brutal murders in Utah. On July 19th, he shot and killed Max Jensen, a gas station attendant, during a robbery in Orem. The following day, he murdered Benny Bushnell, a motel manager in Provo, under similar circumstances. Gilmore's crimes were senseless and brutal, carried out with cold precision and a lack of remorse that shocked the local community. Gilmore was quickly apprehended and confessed to both murders. His trial was swift, and on October 7, 1976, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. What made Gilmore's case extraordinary was his insistence on accepting his sentence and forgoing all appeals, a stance that was highly unusual at the time. As Gilmore's execution date approached, he made a final request that highlighted his acceptance of his fate. He asked for a hamburger, hard-boiled eggs, a baked potato, coffee, and 3 shots of Jack Daniel's whiskey. This meal request, particularly the whiskey, was not granted due to prison regulations. On January 17, 1977, Gary Gilmore was executed by firing squad at the Utah State Prison. His execution was the first in the United States in nearly a decade, following a de facto moratorium on capital punishment. Gilmore's case reignited national debates about the death penalty and its place in the American justice system. Gilmore's final words, "Let's do it," became infamous, symbolizing his defiance and readiness to face the consequences of his actions. His story was later immortalized in Norman Mailer's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Executioner's Song, which detailed the complex and often contradictory facets of Gilmore's character and the societal implications of his crimes and punishment. Timothy McVeigh. Timothy James McVeigh was the perpetrator behind the Oklahoma City bombing, a devastating act of terrorism that occurred on April 19, 1995. McVeigh, along with accomplice Terry Nichols, orchestrated the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, resulting in the deaths of 168 people and injuring over 600 others. The attack was motivated by McVeigh's extreme anti-government beliefs and his desire to retaliate against what he saw as government overreach and the handling of the Waco siege in 1993. Following the bombing, McVeigh was apprehended and quickly linked to the attack through forensic evidence and eyewitness testimonies. In 1997, he was convicted on federal charges of murder, conspiracy, and using a weapon of mass destruction. McVeigh's trial was highly publicized and drew intense scrutiny due to the scale of the devastation and the motivations behind the attack. As McVeigh's execution date approached, he made a surprisingly simple final meal request: 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. This choice stood in stark contrast to the magnitude of his crime, prompting reflection on his state of mind and the banality of his last request in the face of such catastrophic actions. Despite his request, McVeigh's final wish for a stay of execution to allow for further appeals was not granted. On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute. His execution marked the first federal execution in the United States since 1963 and brought a measure of closure to the victims' families and the nation at large. McVeigh's case remains a sobering reminder of the potential for violence driven by extremist ideologies and the profound impact of domestic terrorism. All right, guys, it's time for our subscribers' pick. The debate over granting last wishes to death row inmates has always been a contentious one, and the image above has ignited a new wave of questions and discussions. The photo, which recently surfaced online, shows an inmate in an orange jumpsuit with a woman in a neon green bikini standing before him. This provocative scene has led many to wonder, could this be an actual last wish of an inmate? And if so, should it be granted? The idea of fulfilling such a request raises significant ethical and moral questions. Traditionally, last meal requests have ranged from elaborate feasts to simple comforts, but the notion of allowing an inmate to be intimate with or simply be in the presence of a woman before execution pushes the boundaries of what is considered acceptable. If this were indeed an inmate's last wish, the implications would be profound. On one hand, granting such a request could be seen as a final act of compassion, allowing a human connection in their last moments. On the other hand, it could be viewed as an inappropriate indulgence that detracts from the severity of their crimes and the justice being served. What are your opinions about granting last wishes to inmates on death rows? Share your opinions in the comment section. Odell Barnes. Odell Barnes Jr. was convicted of a crime that shook the community of Wichita Falls, Texas. In 1989, Barnes was accused of the brutal murder and mistreatment of Helen Bass at her home. The crime shocked the local community due to its violent nature and the impact on the victim's family and friends. Barnes was arrested shortly after the murder and subsequently charged with capital murder and mistreatment. His trial was highly publicized, with the prosecution presenting strong evidence linking Barnes to the crime scene. In 1990, he was convicted and sentenced to death. As Barnes's execution date approached, he made a final wish that was both poignant and symbolic. Instead of requesting a traditional last meal, Barnes asked for justice, equality, and world peace. This abstract request reflected his philosophical stance and his desire to address broader societal issues, rather than seeking personal comfort or satisfaction in his final moments. However, Barnes's wish for justice, equality, and world peace was not granted in a literal sense, as it represented an aspiration rather than a tangible request that could be fulfilled by prison officials. Despite this, his request sparked contemplation and discussion about the nature of final wishes and the societal issues that permeate cases of capital punishment. On March 1, 2000, Odell Barnes Jr. was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. His execution, like many others on death row, prompted debates about the fairness and effectiveness of the death penalty as a form of justice. Velma Barfield. Velma Margie Barfield, often referred to as the death row granny, gained notoriety for her crimes as a convicted serial killer in the United States. Born in 1932 in South Carolina, Barfield's criminal activities began to surface in the early 1970s. Over a span of several years, she was responsible for the deaths of several individuals, primarily through poisoning. Her victims included family members and acquaintances, many of whom were elderly or infirm. Barfield's crimes came to light in 1978 after an investigation into the death of her fiancé, Stuart Taylor. Authorities discovered that Barfield had poisoned Taylor with arsenic in an attempt to cover up thefts from his bank accounts. This revelation led to further investigations, revealing a pattern of arsenic poisoning in other deaths linked to Barfield. In 1978, Velma Barfield was arrested, and in 1979, she confessed to multiple murders. She was convicted of the murder of Stuart Taylor and sentenced to death. Barfield's case garnered significant media attention due to her status as a woman and her unexpected role as a serial killer. As her execution date approached, Velma Barfield made a surprisingly mundane final meal request: a bag of cheese doodles and a can of Coca-Cola. This choice of snack, known for its simplicity and everyday appeal, starkly contrasted with the gravity of her crimes and her reputation as a serial killer. The request humanized Barfield in the eyes of some, prompting reflection on the banality of her final moments, despite the heinous nature of her crimes. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection at the Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. Her execution marked the end of a tumultuous legal battle and brought closure to the families of her victims. Victor Feguer. Victor Feguer, born in 1935, became known for a singular and unusual crime that led to his eventual execution. In March 1960, Feguer abducted and murdered Dr. Edward Bartels, a physician from Dubuque, Iowa. The motive behind the crime remains murky, but Feguer's actions shocked the community and led to a swift investigation and apprehension. Feguer's trial in 1961 was marked by the severity of his crime and the public outcry it generated. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, making his case a focal point for debates surrounding justice and the death penalty. As Feguer's execution date approached, he made a peculiar final wish that left many perplexed. His request was for a single olive with the pit still in it. Feguer expressed a hope that the olive seed would germinate and grow into an olive tree, symbolizing peace and life from his grave. This symbolic gesture contrasted sharply with the seriousness of his crime and the impending nature of his punishment. However, Feguer's wish for the olive seed was not granted in a literal sense due to practical and security reasons. Despite this, his request added an enigmatic and contemplative element to his final moments, prompting reflection on the nature of life, death, and the legacy one leaves behind. On March 15, 1963, Victor Feguer was executed by hanging at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison, Iowa. His execution marked the end of a legal saga that had captivated the nation and raised profound questions about justice and the moral implications of capital punishment. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. Her early life was marked by instability and hardship, including allegations of abuse and abandonment. Wuornos's troubled upbringing laid the foundation for a tumultuous adulthood characterized by criminal behavior and violence. Wuornos's criminal activities came to public attention in the late 1980s, when she was arrested for a series of murders committed in Florida. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos killed 7 men, primarily by shooting them at point-blank range. Her victims were mostly middle-aged men, whom she claimed had solicited her for sex, leading her to perceive the killings as acts of self-defense. In 1992, Aileen Wuornos was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Her trial and subsequent legal proceedings drew significant media attention, with debates focusing on her troubled past, mental state, and the ethics of capital punishment. As Wuornos's execution date approached, she declined a special last meal and instead requested a cup of black coffee. This simple request, devoid of extravagance or indulgence, reflected Wuornos's calm demeanor and acceptance of her fate, despite the severity of her crimes. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida. Her execution marked the end of a controversial case that had captivated the nation and sparked debates about the motives behind her crimes and the appropriateness of the death penalty. And that's all for today. Thanks for joining us.